I got my first job when I was 11 years old, delivering newspapers to homes in our neighborhood. So every day after school, I would ride my bicycle through the neighboring blocks, tossing papers to about 60 homes. And then once a month, I had to go and collect the bills. So I would usually plan that for the last week of the month. I would do it in the evening when I was sure that I could find people at home, and it took me about 5 nights to get that task completed. And I developed a little ritual during my collection week. If the sky was clear, then when I got home, I would park my bike. I would go out in our front yard and lay back on our lawn, and I would just gaze up at the night sky. I was fascinated with what I could see. The moon and the stars, sometimes some planets, sometimes a little hint of the mistiness of the Milky Way. I was overwhelmed by the vastness and the majesty of the universe. And that's where some of my first spiritual stirrings began. Because of what I could see, I started to wonder and to ask, could there in fact be a God? A God who made all of this? Looking at the night sky turned my thoughts toward heaven, and it was one of the many steps in my journey to faith. And I find that I'm not alone. God often uses the wonder of His creation, and in particular, the wonder and majesty of the night sky to arouse the curiosity of people and to draw them to Him. He did that as one of the events of the very first Christmas. When Jesus was born, a very strange star appeared in the sky, and it caught the eye of some very strange men called magi. Matthew describes this very unusual story for us in his biography of Jesus in chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. I'd like us to look at this text together and let this story capture our attention. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Big lie. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. What a very strange story. What is God up to? Who are these men? Why are they searching for a Jewish king? And why are they following a star? This morning I wanted us to dig into this story a bit and see if we can come up some answers that will help us flesh out what God is really doing. And now that we have the big picture of the story in mind, I want to go back through this and focus on some specific pieces so that we can dig out the meaning of this text. And I want us to begin by trying to understand these very strange men that Matthew introduces to us in verses 1 to 3. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So the people of Jerusalem are going about their normal business when these magi, known in some Bible translations as the wise men, they show up in Jerusalem, and they are searching for a newly born king. And this news really irritates King Herod, because if there's another king around, that will threaten his power. And his very unfavorable reaction shakes up the citizens, because they know that if King Herod's not happy, nobody will be happy. The citizens of Jerusalem live in great fear of King Herod and the murderous rages for which he is known. And that rage is usually expressed when his power feels threatened. That's not the only reason, though, for the people to be disturbed. These magi are foreigners. They're Gentiles, not Jews. And why would non-Jewish men be searching for a Jewish king? That's just odd. Now, it might be at times in those days that if there was a really great empire and a very strong king, foreigners might send a delegation to that king out of fear to pledge their obedience and their allegiance. But these foreigners aren't fearful, and they're obviously not an official political delegation, and they're clearly not coming to honor a Jewish ruler, or they would be making an official visit to Herod. They'd be calling on him. But they're not. Because they're not searching for an earthly king to obey. They're searching for a spiritual king to worship. All of this is very, very strange, and it makes absolutely no sense to the citizens of Jerusalem. However, when we begin to peel away the layers and dig into the background of these strange foreign visitors, the picture starts to become a bit more clear. Magi are very interesting men. They are learned, scholarly types. They're knowledgeable in philosophy, religion, medicine, and science. And the ancestors of these particular men began to study astronomy in particular in great detail about 700 to 800 years before the birth of Jesus. They became experts in chronicling the movement of the stars and the sun and the planets. Here's what's interesting. Based on what they observed scientifically, they moved beyond science and they started to place meaning in the movements that they observed in the heavens. So these astronomers also became astrologers. And over the years, as magi practiced their craft, it became obvious to everyone that they understood the heavens like no one else. They would chart the movements of heavenly bodies, and then they would predict events. And all of that was amazing to their contemporaries. So they became identified as a priestly class. And they served as royal advisors to rulers in Persia and Babylon. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us where this particular group of magi comes from, but they must travel from either Persia or Babylon, which means they have a very long journey to get to Bethlehem. They travel several hundred miles. Their journey might even be more than 1,000 miles. And that tells us that finding this Jewish king is extremely important to them. They have seen some kind of sign in the stars, and their entire belief system says, follow, find this king, and worship him. Here's what puzzles me, though. Why are Gentiles even searching for a sign of a Jewish king? That's not natural. It's not something they normally would do. Somehow, some way, somewhere, they must have been told about a Jewish king that would someday come. Where would they get that information? We really don't know. But history gives us some fascinating hints. The best evidence is that the Magi originated in Babylon. And this group came into existence not long before Daniel, a faithful Jew, was exiled in Babylon. We know from what we read in the Old Testament that Daniel became an influential man within the royal Babylonian court, which means that he knew men who were Magi. And we know from Daniel's account of his life that he was a man of faith. And so it's likely that he told his contemporaries about his faith, including the Jewish king, the Messiah, that would be coming. That was such a key piece of hope that the Jewish people held on to. It would be odd if Daniel had the chance not to tell them about that. So if Magi heard some story about a future Jewish spiritual king, because of their perspective, they would believe that that would be predicted through a sign in the heavens. The stars would tell when that Jewish king arrived. And therefore, they would be looking for signs. And God has arranged things so that they find what they're looking for. Now, what I've just said is only speculation. We don't know that for sure. What we do know is this: something is driving these men. They are willing to leave their homeland and travel a long way to find a Jewish king. And their attention has been captured by a star. A very unusual star. And I'd like us to zero in now on the verses in our passage that describe this strange sight in the heavens. Look at verse 2. They asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Then down in verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child. This is a fascinating account. The star mentioned here is usually referred to as the Star of Bethlehem. Sometimes it's called the Christmas star. And this story has fascinated astronomers for years. The biblical account of the birth of Jesus is so well known and so familiar that even non-Christian astronomers have become intrigued with this story and have tried to identify this star. First and foremost, was it actually a star? Or was it some other celestial object, such as a planet or a comet? Or did God perhaps supernaturally create some phenomena in the heavens that defies scientific explanation? Now, all of those conjectures are possible. Our God can certainly perform miracles that confound the laws of science because he created those laws in the first place. And he also can perform miracles by orchestrating the laws of science to conform to his timing of events. Modern astronomers have focused on the scientific side of this question, trying to identify this star. And particularly in our day and age, they are able to continue learning about celestial events of the past because they now have the ability to plug data into planetarium computers and work backwards to see what the heavens look like long ago. And modern astronomers have uncovered some fascinating scientific evidence. In October of 2014, astronomers from around the world met in Belgium for one purpose: to discuss the Star of Bethlehem. They analyzed the movements of planets and constellations, and they linked those movements to what we know about ancient astrological beliefs, because that's part of what was driving the Magi. They wanted to answer this question: what would need to happen in the stars and in the sky to capture the attention of the Magi? And after comparing notes, they boiled it down and they said to really capture the attention and to say a Jewish king is coming, a very rare specific phenomena would have to happen, an event that had three individual components. First, the planet Jupiter, which was the sign of royalty, would have to rise in the east. And it's rather interesting that when Jupiter rises that way, astronomers call it a morning star, not a planet. Second, when Jupiter appeared, it would have to be in close proximity to the Aries constellation, because Aries, the ram, is a sign associated with Judea. And third, as Jupiter rose near Aries, the moon would have to pass in front of Jupiter, because that was a sign that a major event was about to take place. So if all three of those very rare signs converged and took place at the same time, the Magi would be convinced that a king was going to be born in Judea. So having identified the kind of event that would capture the attention of the Magi, these astronomers wanted to find out, did such an event occur? And they found out that yes, it did occur. That exact event took place on April 17th in the year 6 BC. They figured that out. I marvel at that. Now, Jesus likely was born sometime between 6 BC and 4 AD. So the timing is right. That event would definitely capture the attention of the Magi. It put them on alert that great events were about to take place. But as pivotal as that was, that particular event would not guide them on their journey, because as we see in our text, the Christmas star moved across the sky, leading them from their homeland in Jerusalem, from their homeland to Jerusalem, and then on to Bethlehem. This very strange Christmas star was a moving star, and it was visible for a very long time. Perhaps as long as 2 years. See, we sometimes in reading the Bible lose track of the lapse of time of these events. But we know, for example, that the Magi had to travel a long way to find Jesus. So even though the star first appeared when he was born, they did not arrive immediately because of their long trek. Then we see here in verse 7 of our text that Herod questioned the Magi very closely. He wanted to nail down the exact time that the star appeared. And if you read ahead in chapter 2 of Matthew, you find that Herod takes action against all children aged 2 and under. You see, when the Magi arrive in Jerusalem, Herod doesn't think he's a baby anymore. He thinks he's a child who could be as old as 2 years. Time has passed. And then sometimes we miss the plain meaning of a Bible text. And I don't know if you saw this in verse 11, but the wise men do not arrive at a manger where they see a baby. They arrive at a house where they see a child. That's what Matthew lays out for us here. And I know most of you, like me, probably have a little manger set, and it shows the wise men there worshiping as Jesus is in his manger, and it's cute and it's part of the story, and it's just not true. They weren't at the manger. They showed up later on at a house to see a child, because time time has passed, significant time. And the Magi have been led on this very long and strange journey by this very strange star that behaves in some unusual ways. The star that they follow rises, becomes visible above the horizon, and it remains in sight for a year or even two. It appears in the eastern morning sky when they first see it, and then it moves. And later, as they travel from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, that star is visible in the southern evening sky. And then at the very end of their journey, it appears to stop over the house where Jesus is living. Astronomers have looked at the data here in the text, and they've said there's only one celestial body that fits this description and behaves in this way, and it's a comet. Comets move across the sky. They can remain visible for an extended period of time. And once in a while, it looks like they actually come to a stop. And ancient people attached great significance to the appearance and movement of comets. And in fact, they viewed them as a special type of star. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that a comet stood still over Jerusalem in the days leading up to the Judean War, which was one of the great Jewish revolts against their Roman masters. Russia. And then in 12 BC, the Roman historian Cassius Dio writes, "The star called a comet," isn't that an interesting phrase? "The star called a comet stood over the city of Rome for several days." And shortly after that comet appeared, the influential Roman leader Marcus Agrippa died. Ancient people paid attention to comets. Comets caught their attention. So could the Christmas star actually be a comet? Many Christian astronomers believe so. In 1991, in a professional technical journal, the Royal Astronomical Society of Britain laid out the scientific evidence explaining the Christmas star as a comet. And then more recently, biblical scholar Colin Nichol, he offers his view of the scientific and biblical evidence in a book called The Great Christ Comet. It's a fascinating book to read. So astronomers have given us some tantalizing data, some intriguing hints and evidence. We have the evidence of Jupiter rising in 6 BC and a comet possibly rising from that same location a bit later. And if we put those two distinct things together, we come up with a very plausible explanation behind Matthew's description here in our text. The Magi go on alert when they see Jupiter arise in the east, predicting the coming of a Jewish king. And then when a comet rises up from that same place a few months or a few short years later, they are ready. They are ready to act. And that comet seems to deliberately lead them from their homeland, cross-country, to Jerusalem and on to Bethlehem to find this king who's been predicted in the stars. Now, we don't know if that's the exact way that it unfolded. I don't know that in this life we'll ever know the exact identity of the Christmas star. What we can say is this: Matthew gave us an accurate description of events. What he writes lines up with what we know about astronomy and astrology in his day. It helps to verify this account, and it reinforces a very important fact. Matthew was not making stuff up. He wasn't making up stuff about a star, and he wasn't making up stuff about Jesus. He is a reliable historian and a reliable biographer. And since we have some plausible scientific factual evidence that underlies this story of the Christmas star, then we ought to give great weight and serious consideration to what Matthew tells us about Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah. Jesus, the King. And in faithfully writing this account, Matthew wants us to know that God, who controls the cosmos, God caused these these events. He caused this strange star to appear so that these strange men would come and announce the birth of Jesus in Jerusalem. Think about that. Non-Jews announcing the birth of the Messiah to God's chosen people. This was God's invitation. His invitation for people to pay attention to what he was doing and then to respond. And Matthew here in this text records for us two very strange responses to this event. We find the first one starting in verse 4. Let's take a look at that. When he, that's Herod, had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. So consider what's happening here. King Herod is not known as a particularly religious man. But he figures out that if what the Magi say is true, then they're looking for the Jewish Messiah. If the Messiah has, in fact, been born, then he's in trouble. He wants to find that young king and get rid of him. And so he consults here with the Jewish religious leaders, and their response is tragic. It's heartbreaking. These are men who know about the coming of the Messiah. These are men who should be eagerly searching for the Messiah. And yet when Herod makes his request, they don't display any curiosity about why he's asking. They know that it's not clearly an intellectual exercise because all of Jerusalem is buzzing about the Magi. And yet these religious leaders display no desire to find out if their Messiah actually might have been born. And it's heartbreaking to realize that these men have great knowledge of the Bible, but they have very little faith. They've got the story down, but they don't do anything with what they know. Bethlehem is just 6 miles from Jerusalem. And they're not willing to be bothered. They're not willing to be inconvenienced. They're not willing to be interrupted to go 6 miles and find out if it just might be true. It is a strange and tragic response from men who have been entrusted with the truth of God. And what a contrast, because while the Jewish religious leaders aren't willing to travel 6 miles to find the Messiah, these foreign magi have traveled hundreds of miles to find the Messiah. And as a result, they actually meet Jesus, as we see in verse 11. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So these magi don't just show up to honor Jesus. They worship Jesus. Think about that. Grown men worshiping a child. Gentiles worshiping a Jewish child as their spiritual king. That's just strange. And some of the gifts that they bring and present to Jesus, those also are rather strange. And I personally think that God somehow gives these magi some kind of spiritual insight, because their gifts actually do line up with the roles that Jesus will play in his life. Gold, that's a gift that you give to royalty. It's considered the most precious and costly of metals. That's a very suitable gift. But how about frankincense? Incense is a gift that you give to a priest. Incense is used in temple rituals and sacrifices. You light incense when you pray. It's a gift for a priest. Myrrh is a gift for death. because it's used as an embalming spice. And so with these gifts, the Magi honor the coming life and coming ministry of Jesus. Those gifts affirm that he will be the King of Kings. He will be the ultimate high priest who intercedes between God and mankind. And he will be the Savior of the world who will die for the sins of mankind. Gifts so appropriate for Jesus. And as I read this simple verse and see them worship and give him gifts, something really hits me. In our very self-centered age, it is so easy to condition all of our behavior by asking the question, what's in it for me? These Magi don't seem interested in that question. They've traveled hundreds of miles simply to meet Jesus. And once they're there, they don't expect a single thing from him. They're there to give him their gifts. They're there to worship him simply for who he is. What a great example of faith. And so we see this incredible contrast between these two different responses. The Jewish religious leaders have detailed knowledge about God and detailed knowledge of his plans, and they have so little faith. And the Magi, these foreign astronomers and astrologers, they actually have very little detailed knowledge about God and his plans and purposes, but oh, do they have faith. I find myself wondering, which one of these two groups am I most like? Which one of these two groups are you most like? I love this story. I love it because it's so strange. God loves to do strange and unusual things to catch our attention. And he uses this strange star to catch the attention of some strange men. And as I assess this story here for us in the Bible, I think that God does this for at least three very distinctive reasons. First, by drawing these Gentiles to Jesus, God is making it clear that this Jewish king is not coming only for the Jews. The Jewish Messiah is for everyone, and everyone will be welcome in his presence. And in the ancient world, where religion was cultural and national and tribal, that was a very strange and wonderful message for God to send. And second, I think this story is a wake-up call to the people of God. I've met, unfortunately, a lot of Christians who are a lot like these ancient priests. Christians who are so proud of all the knowledge that they have, but they don't really have a living faith. And they may know a lot about Jesus, but they don't necessarily know Jesus. And that leads to the third reason I think that God gave us this story. I think he's telling us that when it comes to our souls, what matters most is who we know, not what we know. That's the example we learn from the Magi. And if we're spiritually curious like they were, if we have enough faith, and if we're willing to be inconvenienced to go searching for Jesus, we will find him. And we don't have to know a lot to get connected to him. God used the stars to lead these Magi, these ancient astronomers and astrologers, to Jesus. So I reflect back on my life and my journey. God used the nighttime sky, and he used the encouragement and testimony example of believers who he put in my life. And ultimately, he used the testimony of the Bible itself, the timeless Word of God. All of those things together were part of my journey to faith so that I could get to know Jesus. And God will use all kinds of things in the lives of men and women. And he will use the events of your life to lead you to Jesus if you're searching. And once we find Jesus, He wants us to keep making the effort to get more closely connected to him all the time. This strange story of Christmas reminds us that God sent Jesus into the world so that we could find the Savior. And it really boils down to one key question. Do you know Jesus? That's the ultimate question. It's really the only question that ultimately matters. And if you're here and you do know Jesus, then let this story be an invitation to you. During this season when we celebrate his birth, don't overlook him. Don't miss him the way those ancient priests missed him. Spend time with Jesus as we celebrate his birth. And if you don't know Jesus, then be encouraged by the example of the Magi. Keep searching, because God will reward your search. And if you want to get connected to Jesus today, then I invite you to speak with me after the service. Don't let this strange story of Christmas simply be something that you're removed from, some words on a page. Let this strange story of Christmas become your story as you get connected to Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's why we celebrate his birth.